Don't touch me. The words didn't echo. They cut, clean and sharp, slicing through the polished air of the 42nd floor boardroom like something too real for a room built on controlled smiles. Ava Brooks felt it before she fully processed it. The slight recoil, the subtle withdrawal of Richard Caldwell's hand, as if her presence alone had crossed an invisible line. For half a second, her hand remained extended, suspended between them, steady, unwavering. Then came the sound. A quiet chuckle. Then another. Soft at first, like a ripple across still water, but it spread quickly. Someone shifted in their leather chair. Another leaned back, arms crossed, watching like it was entertainment. Ava slowly lowered her hand. Not rushed, not embarrassed, just deliberate. The glass table beneath them reflected everything. The curve of smirks, the flicker of amusement in polished eyes, the overhead lights casting a cold, even glow across faces that had already made up their minds. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, expression composed, almost bored. "Let's not waste time," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "We all know why we're here." Ava said nothing. She stepped forward instead, placing her slim folder on the table. It looked almost out of place among the thick binders and glowing tablets, understated, quiet, like her. A man to her left whispered something under his breath. Another shook his head faintly, already disengaging. She could feel it, the weight of assumption settling over the room, pressing in from every direction. Not just doubt, dismissal. But Ava didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it sit, let it stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, grounded, calm. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory flickered. Her mother standing at a counter years ago, smile tight, waiting to be acknowledged while others were helped first. Ava blinked once, steadying herself, pulling the present back into focus. Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the side. "You have 5 minutes," he said. The room quieted, not out of respect, but expectation. Ava nodded once, then tapped her tablet. The screen behind her lit up, soft blue against the darker tones of the room. No dramatic opening. No apology. Just numbers. Clean. Precise. A few glances lifted, more out of habit than interest. She began to speak, her voice even, measured, each word placed with intention. No defensiveness. No urgency. And that, more than anything, felt out of place to them. Because she wasn't trying to win them over. Not yet. Across the table, one board member leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, not in skepticism, but curiosity. Ava noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. She moved to the next slide, then paused, just for a second, as if waiting, not for them, for something else. The pause lingered just a fraction too long for comfort, subtle but noticeable, like a breath held in a room that had forgotten how to exhale. Ava did not look at them when she stopped speaking. She looked at the screen, then at the small clock embedded in the corner of her tablet, her expression unchanged, almost detached. Across the table, Richard tilted his head slightly, a faint crease forming between his brows. It was not concern yet, not even suspicion, just the first flicker of something that did not fit the script he had already written in his mind. One of the board members cleared his throat quietly, fingers tapping against a pen, waiting for her to continue, waiting for the pitch to stumble into desperation. But it did not come. Ava let the silence settle deeper, thickening the air. The faint hum of the overhead lights became louder, or maybe everything else had simply gone still. She moved to the next slide, but the data was incomplete. Missing projections. No closing summary. A deliberate gap. A man on the far end frowned, leaning closer to his screen as if the numbers might reveal themselves if he stared long enough. Richard exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound edged with impatience. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough weight to pull the room back to his side. A few heads nodded faintly, reassured by his tone, by the familiar rhythm of dismissal. Ava finally looked up, her gaze steady, meeting his without hesitation. "Not exactly," she said, her voice calm, almost soft. The words did not challenge him. They did not defend her. They simply existed, firm and grounded. Richard leaned forward slightly now, elbows brushing the table, interest sharpening behind his controlled expression. "Then I suggest you get to the point," he replied. There was a hint of amusement in his voice again, but thinner this time, less certain. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone, resting beside the tablet, the screen dark for a moment before it lit up in her hand. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it drew attention in a way her slides had not. A few eyes shifted. Someone in the corner straightened in their chair. The man who had leaned forward earlier now watched closely, his pen no longer tapping. Ava glanced at the screen, then lowered it again without showing anyone. Not yet. Her thumb hovered for a second, as if confirming something only she could see. Richard's gaze followed the motion, narrowing slightly. "We are not here for theatrics," he said, a trace of irritation slipping through. "If you have something relevant, present it." Ava set the phone down beside her tablet, aligning it carefully, almost methodically. Then she looked up again, her expression unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted. Not confidence, not defiance. Certainty. "I agree," she said quietly. Another pause. Shorter this time, sharper. Somewhere in the room, a chair creaked as someone adjusted their posture. The energy had changed, subtle but undeniable, like the air just before a storm when everything feels too still to be safe. Richard noticed it. He did not show it, but he felt it, the faint disruption of control, the sense that something was moving just outside his reach. Ava's eyes flicked once more to the clock on her tablet, then back to him, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, for timing. The second hand on Ava's tablet clock clicked forward with a soft, almost inaudible tick, but in the silence it felt louder than it should have, like a signal only she could hear. She did not move right away. She let that moment settle, let the weight of anticipation stretch just enough to shift the balance in the room. Across the table, Richard straightened slightly, his fingers now steepled in front of him, the casual confidence from earlier tightening into something more controlled, more alert. He was watching her differently now. Not with respect. Not yet. But no longer with dismissal alone. "You are out of time," he said finally, his voice firm, reclaiming authority, anchoring the room back to his rhythm. A few members nodded, relieved by the structure, by the return to something familiar. Ava glanced at him, then at the screen behind her, still displaying incomplete data, still missing the final piece everyone expected. "I know," she replied, her tone unchanged, almost gentle, as if time itself had never been the point. That answer did not land the way he expected. It lingered, slightly off, slightly unsettling. Richard's jaw shifted subtly, the smallest sign of irritation breaking through. "Then we are done here," he said, already reaching for the folder in front of him, already preparing to close the meeting on his terms. Chairs shifted faintly. A pen clicked shut. Someone near the end of the table leaned back, ready to disengage completely. And then Ava picked up her phone. The motion was simple, but this time it was not quiet. The screen lit her face for a brief second, cool light reflecting in her eyes. She looked at it longer now, reading something carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just confirming. A single notification, then another. Her thumb moved once across the screen, deliberate. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and placed the phone flat on the glass table, sliding it forward just enough for the nearest board members to see. No announcement, no explanation, just a screen. At first, no one moved. Then one man leaned closer, his brow tightening as he read. The color shifted in his face, not dramatically, but enough. He blinked once, then again, as if verifying what he was seeing. "What is that?" someone asked quietly from the far end, the question not directed at anyone specific, just hanging in the air. The man did not answer immediately. He turned the phone slightly, angling it so the others could see. One by one, heads tilted, eyes narrowing, the room drawing inward around that single point on the table. Richard did not lean in. Not yet. He watched them instead, watched the change ripple across faces that had been so certain minutes ago. His fingers stilled. "If there is something you would like to share," he said, slower now, more measured, "you should say it." Ava did not look at him. Her gaze remained on the table, on the reflection of the screen in the glass, on the quiet unraveling happening in front of her. "I already did," she said softly. That was when Richard moved. He leaned forward, just enough to see past the others, just enough for his eyes to catch the numbers glowing on the screen. The room did not laugh this time. It did not whisper. It held still, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than before. And for the first time since she walked in, Ava did not feel the need to wait. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because the room had not caught up to what it had just seen. The numbers on the screen were not abstract, not projections, not hopeful estimates buried in a pitch deck. They were confirmed. $3 billion, committed, time-stamped, real. The glow from the phone reflected faintly across the polished table, duplicating the figure in reverse beneath it, as if even the room itself needed to double-check. Richard's eyes did not move at first. They stayed fixed on the screen, steady, calculating, searching for error, for inconsistency, for anything that would return control back to him. But there was nothing to challenge. No footnote. No condition visible from a glance. Just a clean confirmation from a name everyone in that room recognized. A name that did not make impulsive decisions. A chair shifted sharply to his right. One of the board members leaned forward, closer than before, his earlier indifference gone, replaced with something quieter, heavier. "This just came through?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the casual confidence from minutes ago. Ava nodded once. 90 seconds ago, she said. No emphasis. No satisfaction. Just fact. Another notification buzzed lightly against the glass, the vibration subtle but impossible to ignore. A second confirmation. The same number. The same source. Reinforced. Someone at the far end let out a breath they had not realized they were holding. It sounded louder than it should have. Richard finally reached forward, his hand moving with measured control, and picked up the phone. He did not ask permission. He did not need to. His eyes moved quickly now, scanning, verifying, cross-checking the sender, the structure, the attached terms. The silence in the room tightened as everyone waited, not for the information, but for his reaction. Because his reaction would define what this moment meant. He set the phone back down carefully, not sliding it this time, but placing it exactly where it had been. His posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Less relaxed. More present. "That is a significant commitment," he said, his voice slower now, each word placed with precision. Ava watched him, her expression unchanged, but her shoulders no longer carried the quiet weight they had when she first walked in. "It is," she replied. Across the table, the man who had been whispering earlier now sat completely still, his hands folded, eyes locked on Ava, as if seeing her for the first time. Another board member adjusted his tie, a small, unconscious gesture, as if trying to recalibrate himself within a room that no longer followed the same rules. Richard leaned back again, but the ease from before was gone, replaced by something sharper, strategic. "And you are suggesting," he continued, "that this changes the structure of the discussion." Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, let it expand, let the room feel the shift before she defined it. Her fingers rested lightly against the table again, but this time there was no pressure behind them. No grounding needed. "I am not suggesting anything," she said finally. "I am showing you what already changed." The words landed quietly, but they did not need volume. Around the table, the energy had turned completely. The same people who had leaned back now leaned forward. The same eyes that had dismissed now calculated. And for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of power was no longer assumed. It was visible. No one reached for their papers anymore. The folders that had once seemed important now sat untouched, slightly out of alignment, as if the room itself had shifted beneath them. Ava did not move to reclaim the phone. She left it where it was, glowing faintly on the glass, a quiet center of gravity that everything now revolved around. Richard's gaze lifted from the table and settled on her again, but it was different this time. Sharper. Measuring. Not the casual dismissal from before, but something more deliberate, more careful. He was recalculating. "Who else has seen this?" he asked, his voice even, but stripped of the earlier ease. It was not a challenge. It was a question of positioning. Ava met his eyes without hesitation. "The same people who sent it," she replied. Simple. Controlled. No elaboration. A few members exchanged quick glances, silent conversations passing between them in fractions of a second. One man reached for his tablet, fingers moving quickly, likely searching, confirming, verifying what they had just witnessed. Another leaned back slowly, but not in dismissal this time. In thought. The room had stopped reacting emotionally. Now it was processing. Richard tapped his finger once against the table, a small, contained motion, but it broke the stillness just enough to draw attention back to him. Timing like this is rarely accidental, he said. His tone had shifted again, not defensive, not aggressive, but probing. You knew this was coming. Ava did not smile. She did not deny it either. I knew they were interested, she said. I did not know when they would decide. That answer landed with a different kind of weight. It suggested control without claiming it, influence without proving it. Across the table, the man who had been skeptical earlier now leaned forward fully, elbows on the glass, studying her with open curiosity. Why now? He asked, more direct than the others, his voice cutting clean through the tension. Ava turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the question, but her answer was not directed at him alone. Because you were about to close the door, she said. The words were calm, but they carried a quiet finality. Not emotional, not reactive, just true. The room absorbed that. Slowly, the implication settled in layers. This was not luck. It was timing, precision. Richard exhaled softly, leaning back again, but this time the movement felt intentional, controlled, as if he were choosing distance to think more clearly. His eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in each face, each subtle shift in posture, each silent change in allegiance. The room was no longer his by default. He could feel it. Ava remained where she was, hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, posture unchanged, but the space around her felt different now. Less like she was standing in their world, and more like they had stepped into hers without realizing it. The overhead lights reflected in the glass again, but now they caught something else too. Stillness. Not the earlier kind, heavy with judgment, but a new kind. Focused. Intentional. Waiting. Richard leaned forward once more, slower this time, his hands resting flat against the table. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we should revisit the terms. It was not an offer. Not yet. But it was no longer a dismissal. Ava held his gaze for a moment, just long enough for the shift to be undeniable. Then she nodded once. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. Because the conversation had already changed. And this time, she was not the one asking to be heard. The word revisit did not land lightly in the room. It shifted something deeper than tone, deeper than posture. It redrew the invisible lines that had been so clearly defined just minutes ago. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the silence hold again, but this time it was not heavy with doubt. It was controlled, deliberate, almost precise. She reached for her tablet, not the phone, and with a single motion the screen behind her changed. The missing data was still missing. The incomplete structure remained exactly as it had been before. A few eyes narrowed again, confusion flickering back for a brief second, as if expecting the rest to suddenly appear now that the power had shifted. But Ava did not fill the gaps. She left them there, visible, intentional. Richard noticed it first. His gaze moved from the screen to her, studying, recalculating again, but this time faster. You did not come here to complete this deal, he said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke it aloud. It was not a question. It was a recognition. Ava met his eyes, steady as before. No, she said. The simplicity of it landed harder than anything she had said so far. Around the table, a subtle ripple moved again. Not laughter, not dismissal, but something closer to unease. Because the structure they had expected, the negotiation they were prepared to control, no longer applied. One of the board members leaned forward, his voice quieter now, more careful. Then what exactly are we discussing? Ava turned slightly, acknowledging him, but her answer was not rushed. She placed her hand lightly on the table, fingers resting against the glass, grounding the moment. You were evaluating whether I was worth your time, she said. Her tone did not accuse. It did not rise. It simply stated what had already happened. No one interrupted. No one denied it. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he did not look away. Ava continued, her voice just as even. Now you are evaluating whether you are worth mine. The words did not echo. They settled. Deep. Final. Across the room, a chair shifted again, but no one leaned back this time. No one disengaged. They stayed where they were, drawn in by a dynamic they had not planned for. Richard leaned forward once more, slower now, his hands flat against the table, fingers spread slightly, as if anchoring himself in a conversation that had moved beyond his control. That is a bold position, he said, but there was no mockery left in his voice. Only focus. Ava did not react to the word bold. She did not defend it. It is an honest one, she replied. The overhead lights cast a steady reflection across the table, catching the edges of documents that no longer mattered, the untouched glasses of water, the faint outline of the phone still resting between them. Everything in the room had remained physically the same, but nothing felt the same. One of the board members cleared his throat again, but this time it was not to interrupt. It was to re-enter the conversation carefully. If the capital is secured, he began, choosing his words more slowly now, then the structure we discussed earlier may not be relevant. Ava nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but she did not expand. She did not guide them. She let them arrive at the conclusion themselves. Richard's eyes shifted briefly toward the man, then back to Ava, tracking the movement of control as it redistributed across the room. He could see it now, not just in her, but in them. The same people who had laughed minutes ago were now recalibrating, aligning themselves with a new center. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled, the motion controlled, deliberate. Then we should be clear, he said, his voice lower now, steadier. What do you want from this room? The question landed differently than the ones before. It did not challenge her. It invited her. Ava held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the shift to be undeniable. Then she glanced briefly at the phone, at the numbers still glowing quietly on the screen, before returning her attention to him. She did not answer right away. She let the weight of the question settle first. Because now, for the first time since she walked into that room, the answer would not be dismissed. The question did not rush her. It did not corner her. It simply sat there, waiting, and Ava let it stay unanswered just long enough for the room to feel its weight, for every person at that table to lean into the silence instead of away from it. Because now silence was no longer a weakness, it was control. She shifted her gaze from Richard to the rest of the room, not scanning, not searching, just acknowledging each presence, each shifting posture, each quiet recalibration that had taken place without a single word being spoken. Then she spoke. Clarity, she said. One word. No emphasis. No decoration. It landed softly, but it did not disappear. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, as if narrowing in on something that required precision to understand. Be specific, he replied, his voice steady, but no longer carrying the same authority it once did. Ava nodded once, almost as if she expected that. Response. You invited me here to assess risk, she continued, her tone even, controlled, each word measured. But you never considered that you might be the variable. The sentence shifted the air again, subtle but undeniable. A man near the center of the table leaned back slightly, absorbing it, not rejecting it. Another lowered his eyes briefly, as if replaying the last 10 minutes with a different lens. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I am not here to ask for capital, she added. That decision has already been made. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the phone, then back to Richard. What I am deciding now is alignment. The word hung in the space between them, unfamiliar in this context, unsettling in its implication. Richard's fingers pressed lightly against the table, the movement small but deliberate, as if grounding himself in a conversation that had shifted beyond numbers and into something less predictable. Alignment, he repeated, slower, testing the weight of it. Ava held his gaze. Values. Timing. Direction, she clarified. Who I build with, and who I do not. No one interrupted her. Not this time. Across the table, the man who had been verifying the numbers earlier now sat completely still, his attention fixed entirely on her, no longer splitting between devices, no longer searching for confirmation. Because the confirmation had already happened. This was something else. Richard leaned back slightly, but not to create distance, to see more clearly, to take in the full picture that had formed without his permission. And what makes you think this room is still under consideration? He asked. It was not dismissive. It was strategic. Ava did not react to the challenge. She let it exist. Because you are still here, she said simply. The answer did not carry pride. It carried observation. A quiet truth. The room absorbed it in silence. No one moved. No one laughed. The same people who had been ready to close their folders were now waiting, fully present, fully engaged, not because they were convinced, but because they were no longer certain. And uncertainty, in a room like this, demanded attention. Ava rested her hand lightly. against the table again, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her presence unmistakable now. "You asked what I want," she continued, her voice softer but clearer. "I want to know if this room can recognize value before it is forced to." The words settled deeply, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes held hers, steady, searching, recalculating again, but slower this time, more careful. Because this was no longer about numbers. It was about something harder to measure. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome was no longer something he could predict. The room did not shift all at once this time. It adjusted in layers, like something carefully recalibrating under pressure, each person finding a new position without fully realizing they had moved. Ava's words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the silence with a quiet permanence that made it impossible to ignore what had just been said. No one looked at the phone anymore. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it had already done its work. Now it was about something else. Richard remained still for a moment longer, his gaze steady on Ava, but behind that stillness, something was changing. Not outwardly, not in a way the room could easily read, but internally, the rhythm had broken. He leaned back slightly, slower than before, his hand brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something tangible. The glass was cool beneath his fingertips, smooth, unchanging, unlike everything else in that moment. "Recognition," he said quietly, almost to himself, testing the word she had left hanging. Then he looked up again, sharper now, more focused. "That assumes we failed to see it." Ava did not respond right away. She let that sit, let the room consider it, let them ask themselves the question before she answered it. A man near the far end shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at another member as if searching for confirmation, but finding none. The room was no longer unified. It was individual. Ava's gaze moved slowly across the table, not lingering, not accusing, just observing. "You saw something," she said. "Finally. Just not enough." The words were calm, but they carried a quiet edge, not of anger, but of truth. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest visible reaction so far, but he did not interrupt. He did not dismiss it. Across the table, one of the senior members exhaled softly, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "We evaluate hundreds of opportunities," he said, his voice measured, but less certain than before. "We rely on patterns, on data, on experience." Ava nodded once, acknowledging the point. "And patterns are useful," she replied, "until they become limits." The sentence landed deeper than expected. A subtle shift passed through the room again, quieter this time, more internal. People were not reacting outwardly anymore. They were thinking. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in concentration. "So you are saying we misjudged you," he said. Ava held his gaze. "I am saying you decided before you understood," she corrected. No accusation, no raised tone, just clarity. The difference mattered. It reframed everything. The room absorbed that slowly. A man who had laughed earlier now looked down at his hands, fingers interlaced, as if trying to reconstruct the moment in his mind, to find where the shift had actually begun. Richard leaned forward again, his hands resting flat against the table, mirroring his earlier posture, but the intention behind it had changed. This was not control. This was engagement. "And now," he asked, his voice lower, more direct. Ava did not hesitate this time. "Now you have more information," she said. A pause. Short. Precise. "The question is what you do with it." The air in the room tightened again, not with tension, but with focus. No one moved. No one spoke. Because the question did not belong to Richard alone. It belonged to all of them. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome was not something that could be decided by a single voice. The question did not disappear after she said it. It expanded, filling the space between every person at the table, pressing quietly against their thoughts, forcing each of them to sit with it a little longer than they were used to. "No." One rushed to answer. Not even Richard. That alone shifted the room again. Ava did not move. She did not fill the silence. She let it work. Across the table, the man who had been verifying the numbers earlier finally spoke, but slower now, more careful, as if choosing each word with intention. "Information changes positioning," he said, almost as a reflection rather than a statement. Ava nodded once, acknowledging it without interrupting. It also reveals it, she replied. That distinction settled deeper than expected. A few heads turned slightly, not toward her, but toward each other, subtle glances exchanged, silent reassessments taking place in real time. Richard remained still, but his eyes shifted, not just on Ava now, but across the entire room, reading the changes, tracking the quiet movement of influence as it redistributed itself. He could see it. The room was no longer anchored to him alone, and he understood what that meant. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his hands resting lightly against the table, no longer pressing, no longer asserting, just present. Then let us be direct, he said, his voice steady, but stripped of anything unnecessary. You have secured capital. You have leverage. What you are asking for now is not access. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. No, she said. It is not. A pause followed, shorter this time, sharper, as if the room itself was learning a new rhythm. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in focus. Then it is influence, he continued. Ava considered that for a fraction of a second, then shook her head lightly. Not influence, she corrected. Alignment. The word returned, but this time it carried more weight, more clarity, shaped by everything that had already been said. Across the table, one of the senior members leaned forward, his expression thoughtful, no longer guarded. Those are not very different in this room, he said quietly. Ava glanced toward him briefly, then back to Richard. They are, she replied. One is about control. The other is about direction. The distinction landed clean, cutting through the last remnants of the old dynamic. No one challenged it. No one dismissed it, because it was no longer abstract. It was visible in the room itself. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing once against the edge of the table again, a habit now, grounding, measuring. And if this room does not align with your direction? He asked. The question was direct, but not confrontational. It carried something new. Awareness. Ava did not hesitate this time. Then nothing changes for me, she said. The answer was calm, but it carried a quiet finality that settled heavily across the table. It was not a threat. It was not leverage being applied. It was independence. Real, undeniable independence. The kind that did not need approval. The room absorbed that in silence. A man who had been silent until now leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, not in frustration, but in realization. Because that answer removed something fundamental from the equation. Need. She did not need them. And that changed everything. Richard held her gaze, steady, searching, recalculating again, but slower now, more deliberate, because the variables had changed completely. This was no longer a negotiation in the traditional sense. It was a decision. And for the first time since the meeting began, it was not entirely his to make. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty. It felt resolved, like something had quietly reached its conclusion without needing to be announced. No one shifted immediately. No one interrupted. The room held still, not because it lacked direction, but because it was adjusting to one that had not been set by them. Ava remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, no longer carrying any weight of expectation. She had already said what needed to be said. Across the table, Richard did not look away. His gaze stayed fixed on her, but it was no longer searching for weakness or inconsistency. It was measuring something else now, something less tangible, something he had not accounted for when she first walked in. He leaned back slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, as if giving himself the space to think without breaking the connection entirely. His fingers rested against the arm of his chair, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. Just still. Independence, he said quietly, almost under his breath, but loud enough for the room to hear. The words settled differently than the others. It did not challenge. It clarified. Ava did not respond. She did not need to. The confirmation had already been made. A board member near the center of the table exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. Another adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking once more toward the phone, then back to Ava, but this time without doubt, without dismissal. Just recognition. Richard leaned forward again, but not with urgency, not with control, but with intention. His hands rested flat against the table, mirroring her earlier posture, but the meaning behind it had changed completely. "Then this is not about whether we proceed," he said, his voice steady, stripped of everything unnecessary. "It is about whether we are invited to." The words landed clean, precise, and for the first time, they did not belong to him alone. They belonged to the reality of the room. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflected something quieter now. Not victory, not satisfaction, just clarity. "Yes," she said. No elaboration, no emphasis, just truth. The room absorbed it fully this time. No hesitation, no confusion. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward slightly, his voice careful, respectful in a way it had not been before. "And what determines that invitation?" he asked. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward him, acknowledging the question, then back to Richard. "Because the answer mattered most there." "The same thing that always should have," she said softly. A pause followed. "Not long. Just enough. How you choose to see me." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Not as a demand, not as a condition, but as a reflection. Richard did not look away. His expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it did. Something subtle, something real. He glanced once around the table, taking in the faces that had laughed earlier, the ones that had dismissed, the ones that had followed his lead without question. Then he looked back at her. The room did not move. It waited, because this was the moment that would define everything that came after. Not the money, not the deal, but the choice. Richard did not speak immediately, and that alone carried more weight than anything he could have said. The room noticed it. The same man who had controlled every moment since the meeting began now held his silence, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that anything rushed would be wrong. His eyes stayed on Ava, steady, unbroken, as if measuring something that could not be calculated on a screen or confirmed in a report. Then, slowly he moved. Not toward the documents, not toward the phone, toward her. His chair shifted quietly against the floor as he stood, the sound soft but unmistakable in the stillness. A few heads turned, not because they expected movement, but because they did not know what this movement meant. Richard stepped around the table, one step at a time, controlled, deliberate, every motion stripped of the performance that had defined him earlier. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to remove distance, not close enough to impose it. Ava did not step back. She did not adjust her posture. She simply watched him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the moment unfolding now had already been accounted for. Richard looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, fully present in a way he had not been before. For a brief second, his gaze flicked to her hand, resting lightly against the edge of the table, the same hand he had refused minutes ago. Then back to her eyes. The room held its breath without realizing it. Because this was no longer about negotiation. It was about acknowledgement. Richard extended his hand. This time, there was no hesitation in the movement. No performance. No audience. Just a simple, deliberate action, offered without words. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the moment sit between them, just long enough for it to mean something. Not drawn out. Not dramatic. Just real. Her eyes remained on his, searching, not for apology, not for validation, but for something. Quieter. Something honest. The room stayed completely still. No shifting chairs. No whispered comments. Just the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant city beyond the glass walls. Then Ava moved. She lifted her hand slowly, steady as before, but this time the air around it felt different. Not suspended. Not uncertain. Intentional. She placed her hand in his. The contact was brief. Firm. Nothing more. No lingering. No emphasis. Just a handshake. But it did not feel small. It did not feel routine. It felt like a correction. Richard's grip was steady, but there was no dominance in it. No subtle pressure to reclaim control. Just acknowledgement. When they released, neither of them stepped away immediately. The space between them remained, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt defined. Behind them, one of the board members exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, but enough to signal the release of tension that had been building since the first moment. Another shifted in his seat, straightening, as if resetting his place in a room that no longer followed the same hierarchy. Richard returned to his seat slowly, not rushing, not reclaiming the head of the table with the same authority as before. He sat, hands resting lightly in front of him, posture composed, but quieter now. "Let us continue," he said, his voice steady, but different. Not leading, not commanding, just present. Ava remained standing for a moment longer, then returned to her place as well, her movements calm, unhurried. The screen behind her still showed incomplete data. The phone still rested on the table. Nothing in the room had changed physically, but everything had shifted. And for the first time since the meeting began, what happened next would not be decided by power alone. The room did not rush back into conversation after the handshake. It eased into it, carefully, as if aware that something fragile had shifted and could not be handled the same way as before. Ava took her seat again, her movements steady, unhurried, her presence no longer needing to prove itself. Across from her, Richard adjusted his posture slightly, but the sharp edges of control that once defined him had softened into something more deliberate, more aware. He glanced briefly at the screen behind her, still incomplete, still missing the pieces that once would have disqualified her entirely. Now, it held a different meaning. "Walk us through what you are building," he said, his voice even, but stripped of assumption. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. Ava reached for her tablet, her fingers moving lightly across the surface, but she did not change the slide. She left the gaps visible. Intentional. "You have already seen the structure," she said. "What you have not seen is the reason it works." The distinction landed quietly, but it shifted attention immediately. A few members leaned forward again, not out of habit, but out of genuine focus. One man picked up his pen, but this time he did not tap it. He waited. Ava's eyes moved briefly across the table, then settled back at the center. "You were looking for completeness," she continued. "But completeness can be misleading." Richard's brow lowered slightly, not in resistance, but in concentration. "Explain that," he said. Ava nodded once. "Complete models assume stable conditions," she replied. "Markets do not stay stable." The room absorbed that without interruption. A man near the end adjusted his glasses again, this time slower, as if giving himself time to process. Ava tapped the screen lightly, and a small section of data highlighted, still partial, still evolving. "What matters is adaptability," she said. "Not perfection." The words were simple, but they reframed everything they had been expecting. Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely together now, no longer pressing into the table. "And you believe your model adapts faster," he said. Ava did not answer immediately. She glanced once at the phone still resting nearby, the confirmation still visible, still real, then back to him. "It already has," she said. The room did not question that. They had seen it happen in real time. One of the senior members exhaled quietly, then spoke, his tone measured but changed. "That kind of responsiveness requires more than structure," he said. "It requires judgment." Ava met his gaze briefly. "It does," she said. "And it requires being willing to see what others overlook." The sentence settled deeply, not as a critique, but as a reflection. No one reacted outwardly, but the meaning did not pass unnoticed. Richard's eyes shifted slightly, tracking the response across the room, reading the subtle agreement forming where doubt had once been. He leaned back again, but not to distance himself, to take in the full scope of what was now unfolding. "Then let us be clear about something," he said, his voice calm, but focused. "If we are to be part of this, we need to understand where we fit." Ava rested her hand lightly against the table again, her posture unchanged, but her presence fully established now. "You do not fit into it," she said. A pause followed. Short, precise. "You grow with it, or you stay where you are." The room held that in silence. No one laughed. No one dismissed it, because it was no longer a challenge. It was a boundary, and for the first time, everyone in that room understood exactly where they stood in relation to it. No one answered her right away, not because they disagreed, but because the truth in her words left no space for easy responses. The room held still again, but this time it was not tension or uncertainty that filled it, it was clarity. The kind that settles slowly, reshaping everything without needing to announce itself. Ava did not move to fill the silence. She did not soften what she had said. She simply sat there, calm, grounded, her presence no longer something to be evaluated, but something to be understood. Across the table, Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze lowering for the first time, not in defeat, but in thought. His fingers brushed once against the edge of the table, then stilled. He had spent years controlling rooms like this, guiding outcomes before they were spoken, shaping decisions before they were questioned. But this was different. This was not a room he could control anymore. And he knew it. He lifted his gaze again, slower this time, meeting hers without the distance that had been there before. Then the decision is already made, he said quietly. Ava held his eyes for a moment, then gave a small nod. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. Because the decision had not been made in this room. It had been revealed in it. Around them, the board members shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but adjustment. A recalibration that no longer needed to be hidden. One of them closed his folder gently, not as a sign of dismissal, but as a recognition that what had just happened could not be contained in documents anymore. Another leaned back, exhaling slowly, his expression thoughtful, no longer guarded. The room had changed. Permanently. Richard's gaze moved once more across the table, taking in the faces that had followed his lead, the ones that had laughed, the ones that had doubted without question. Then he looked back at Ava. We misjudged the moment, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not an apology. Not exactly. But something close to accountability. Ava did not respond to it directly. She did not need to. Instead, she reached for her tablet, and, for the first time since the meeting began, she closed it. The soft click echoed lightly in the room. Final. She stood, her movements calm, unhurried, gathering nothing else, leaving the phone still resting on the table for a brief second longer before picking it up as well. The numbers on the screen faded as it locked, the glow disappearing, but the impact remained. She glanced once around the room, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, just seeing them. Fully. Then her eyes returned to Richard. There was no tension there now. No challenge. Just recognition. Thank you for your time, she said. Her voice was steady, respectful, but it did not carry the same meaning it would have at the beginning. It was not gratitude. It was closure. She turned, walking toward the glass doors without hesitation, her steps quiet against the floor, each one measured, each one certain. No one stopped her. No one called after her. They watched. Not because they had to, because they understood. The door opened with a soft sound, letting in a faint rush of distant city noise, the hum of life continuing outside the controlled stillness of the boardroom. Ava stepped through it, and for a moment, the room remained exactly as it was. Silent. Still. Then the door closed behind her, and the reflection in the glass no longer showed a woman asking to be seen. It showed a room learning what it had almost failed to recognize.